Hello everyone. We are sitting here for a very interesting segment of Explain This. Today we have with us here today Dr. Mayank Singh sir, who's an author and a strategic thinker, and he's going to lend his ideas on will oil change geopolitics again? We have really basic and understated questions about it, and we hope, sir, you'll not find it really, problematic to explain the simple things to us. So we are in between an invasion of a very significant European nation. Ukraine is going through an invasion by Russia. So I would like, sir, first of all, to ask you, what is your stand on the Ukraine-Russia invasion slash war crisis that's going on?
Look, the genesis of the crisis, Chandrali, lies in the expansion of NATO. And I would say the resurgence of Russia under Vladimir Putin. When the Soviet Union started to fall apart in the early 90s, 1991, so the primary problem, you would recall that the world then was divided into two blocks, yes. Europe, NATO and the Warsaw Bloc. So then the NATO bloc was led by the Americans and the Warsaw Pact was led by the Russians, the Soviets. So when it started to fall apart, the Russians, the Soviet Union, under Gorbachev, they were assured by the Americans that the NATO will not move an inch eastward, for the simple reason that the security of Soviet Union historically has been lying in Ukraine. They have always kept Ukraine not only as their civilizational, genesis. Their civilization, the Slavic generation, is the ethnicity is supposed to be rising from Ukraine. So that is not the only reason, but also because nobody wanted nuclear missiles on their border.
That's true.
So Ukraine was supposed to be that buffer. So when Soviet Union started to fall apart, this was one of the assurances which was given by the NATO countries that NATO is not going to move an inch eastward. So that was significant. But starting from 1991, when NATO consisted of 16 countries, today NATO consists of 30 countries. The entire Eastern European bloc has fallen away. And perhaps the only standing, region between the Russians and the NATO is Ukraine.
Yes.
And Ukraine, you must realize, is a military and political pact. So once Ukraine enters NATO, it is but natural that the whole the paradigm will shift to the Soviet borders, the Russian borders. So it's very natural for any country, although I'm not justifying war. War is never an option or a solution for any situation. But as a country, if you look at it tactically, strategically, geopolitically, nobody will want a hostile neighbor ready to invade at any country. So that is where the whole problem lies. The eastward expansion of NATO, Ukraine has been doing military exercises with the NATO for a very long time. So the Russians have always are naturally apprehensive, and Vladimir Putin has this image of this strong man. So the ego of a leader also defines the destiny of that country.
Absolutely.
So on the face of it, Putin was not going to take it lying down. And the invasion could have happened in last April or May. But things were somehow, they settled down. But this time around, I believe Putin had it. He was not going to take it any longer. And that is how the whole war has started. And as you know, once the war starts, it's very easy to start a war.
Yes.
But extremely difficult to stop it.
And negotiate in between as well.
So that is where the situation is as of now.
That's exactly where we find ourselves. And
exactly.
Speaking of negotiations, one is always intrigued by India's position in geopolitics at this point of time, because historically we have been very close to Russia. And the kind of stand that we are having right now, it's a very tightrope kind of a balance. How then would you explain India's position? It's abstaining from all the votes in the UN General Assembly. How would you explain that?
And once the war started, it's very natural that people say that India does not have a dog in the fight.
Yeah.
Obviously, this war has not been started by India.
Absolutely.
India has got nothing to do with what has started the war. India is not a party to the war. So in that way, but having said that, to say that India does not have a dog in the fight is to put it very simplistically. Because the world is so intertwined as of now. It is so together, I would say. Globalization has led to a situation where the world is no longer bifurcated. Boundaries are geographical boundaries only. Every other boundary has been crossed. Having said that, India is one of the very few countries which has not condemned
Yeah.
the Russian invasion,
Yeah.
apparently,
On paper.
on paper. But if you look at the UN, the stand taken at the UN, India did not condemn, India abstained. But then India called for respecting territorial integrity and sovereignty of any country, which is very evidently talking of Ukraine, because that is the invaded country. India has stopped of negotiations. India has called for ceasefire. We want immediate cessation of hostilities. But we have to look at the larger picture also, that in the first intention of the Indian government, which was a very noble intention, was to get all the Indians out of Ukraine. Primarily the students.
The students.
So, if you took a stand in the war and took positions on either side, because if you take a stand, you cannot remain neutral. First, you rule out the option of being a negotiator at some stage, because a negotiator is somebody whom both parties trust.
Yes.
So once you take a side, obviously the other part is ruled out. And if you take a side, then extracting those students was going to be very difficult.
Very difficult.
So that is what India has done. It has now extracted its students. The world powers are at it. India is regularly calling for ceasefire. So that is how we have done diplomatically. Now if I take it further, India not having a dog in the fight or having a dog in the fight, India, I would say, is in a catch-22 situation. And why is India calling for a ceasefire apart from the students and the war part? Is because Indian economy, as with the rest of the world economy, is now in a post-recovery phase, post-COVID. Not post-recovery, recovery phase after post-COVID. The world economy has been in the doldrums. And things have just started to look up after 2 years. So suddenly being hit by war is the worst thing any country could have imagined. Now, I would take it a bit further. You would realize that India imports 85% of its energy needs.
Yes.
And I have the data with me. India imported 4.54 billion barrels per day in financial year 20, which is the peak India has attained. Then the COVID phase came in, and obviously the supply and the demand dropped. Things are again looking upwards. The more this war stretches, the more pressure it is going to put on the oil sector, the energy sector. Russia is the second largest exporter of energy products
After UAE.
after the Saudis.
The
Saudis. After the Saudis, it is the second largest exporter. And once the US has started to impose bans on import of Russian petroleum products and natural gas products, so what this is going to do, today the Brent, that crude oil benchmark, has touched $110 per barrel.
Yeah.
But on Monday, that is, I believe, on Monday, this had touched $139 per barrel. Now this is a phenomenal increase.
It's outrageous.
So when you put it in perspective that the Indian budget for the financial year 2022 and 23 had pegged the per barrel price at $75 per barrel, you can understand what India is going through. The inflationary, at every $10, the economists say that every $10 increase per barrel is going to lead to a rise in around 0.3 to 0.4% rise in inflation. And it's going to bring down the GDP. So we are going to spend more on importing energy.
Yes.
And obviously we are going to spend less on other capital products and projects and expenditure. So it's not going to turn out well for us. It's not going to go well for us.
And it's a very precarious position with regards to the Indian currency as well in the global market.
Obviously, the more pressure, if the inflation goes on worldwide, the currency is going to come down. So it's going to get even more costlier to buy products. So India obviously wants this war to stop. As of now, our import, that pool, the countries where we import our energy from, is very limited. The highest petroleum products we get is from Iraq. Iraq, which is itself not very stable.
It's very
It's
politically
politically very unstable,
precarious,
militarily very
precarious.
unstable. We are not able to get it from Russia, Iran. We are not able to get it from Venezuela. So our pool is very restricted. So the dog, India has a dog in the fight. India needs this war to get over very soon,
Very soon.
because otherwise, I mean, because of the elections and all, the petroleum companies have not increased the prices for the past 3-4 months.
Yeah.
But the elections over, they are under stress.
Yeah.
The oil companies are under stress. They cannot subsidize this any longer,
Any longer.
and they are bleeding. So this is going to come up. So the oil prices have to come down, because it's only going to help the oil exporters. OPEC has already said that if Russia goes out of the picture, no country will be able to replace Russia as an oil exporter.
That's true. Which then sir brings me to my next question in that order. Why does India have such a limited pool? I mean, you spoke about Iraq. Iraq, I understand the position is it's not preferable for us. What about Iran? Why aren't we relying on Iran for our energy resources?
Iran, we used to import petroleum products from Iran. But I'll use a bit of a historical perspective
Certainly,
to
please.
make you understand this. In 2015, there was a joint comprehensive plan of action signed between P5 and 1 countries. The P5 countries were Russia, China, France, Iran, and US. UK, sorry, not Iran, UK,
Right.
plus 1 was Germany. So this JCPOA, as it is called, was signed. So the result of this signing was that sanctions were lifted from Iran. They were able to export oil and get into the international market. But in 2018, President Biden, he again imposed sanctions on Iran and said, and the sanctions are of such nature that any country dealing with Iran, they're not imposing any sanctions and importing. You can import
So
if you want.
said 2018 Biden?
President Trump. President Trump. He imposed a sanction again. So the sanctions, I will explain the sanctions a bit. The sanctions are not that you cannot import oil. You can, go ahead. You buy oil from Iran, but US will impose sanctions on any financial institution doing business with Iran.
Very strict
So
limitations.
most of the world transaction is still done in dollars. So the moment the US banks and the US Treasury and the US financial institutions step in, that country which does business with Iran is going to turn into a pariah. It's going to turn into an outcast. China is still doing it. China is purchasing oil from Iran, and it is it imported, I would say in January, 700,000 barrels per day. Because they are doing business, their transactions are a bit different.
Their statecraft is completely different.
Completely different kind of barter system.
Yes.
Kind of barter system.
Yes.
So they are going on.
That is a different conversation.
That's a different conversation for a different day. So India cannot import oil from Iran.
Yes.
On the other hand, I mean, this is how geopolitics plays out. US, the negotiations going on in Vienna, US stepped out. The rest of the countries remained in that P5 plus 1. You can call it P4 plus 1 after US backed out. The countries are still there. The negotiations, but the countries without US mean nothing. US, we must remember, is still the biggest economic and the military power. Say the biggest global power still in the world. Although China is catching up fast.
And US is waning eventually, but it's still the sun in our solar system.
Absolutely.
In terms of
so the negotiations have started, and they have reached a stage where I would say an understanding might be arrived at very soon. And now US is pressing to bring back Iran into the main fold, because it needs oil. And same alone, US only imports around 8% of all petroleum and all natural energy products from Russia. So it's not going to get hurt very soon. But it's European partners. So 40% of EU's energy comes from Russia. And 33% of its petroleum products comes from Russia. So it's not going to give substitutes, and they have already said they have not sanctioned Russia as far as petroleum is concerned, energy is concerned, because although Germany has suspended the Nord 2 stream pipeline, which was going to bring in fresh natural gas, it's still functional on node 1. So Germany is functional. Netherlands and Germany have said they are not going to stop energy products from Russia.
Okay.
Because if they stop, they are gone.
Where will they get it from?
Say, I mean, it's going to be like any underdeveloped country with the load
Yes.
sheddings and the manufacturing costs going up.
What then about United Kingdom, sir?
United Kingdom has, as usual, followed
Followed suit,
USA.
of course.
So they are not taking oil and energy, but then US is releasing its strategic oil reserves. But it wants Iran to come back into the main fold. Now Russia has stepped in and said very categorically that they are not going to move ahead unless they get guarantees that the sanctions imposed on them because of Ukraine are not applied to their business dealings, their traditional economic and trade and military dealings with Iran. So there is a kind of a stalemate because they cannot go ahead without Russia. They cannot have Russia. But things are moving in a faster pace, and Iran wants to come back into the main fold because its economy is also getting hurt. So and it now knows that it's a major geopolitical player.
It's finally understood. It has dawned on it. So on this chessboard, as we are looking on, it reminds me of a bishop, Israel. What is going to be Israel's position in this stalemate?
So that's a very interesting thing because Israel has never been accepted by Iran in the world community. Iranian president a few years back said that he wanted to annihilate Israel from the map of the earth.
Yes.
Now that's a very strong statement coming from a president.
Yes.
So Israel has been very, very wary of anything Iranian. And coincidentally, around six nuclear scientists. It has a huge nuclear program, Iran.
Yes.
Which is why the JCPOA, Trump had backed out of, because they said that the JCPOA, I would like to go back a bit. Now, what the JCPOA had done, that it had said that Iran can retain only 3% of its enriched nuclear uranium. 97% was going to go away. And that 3% was to have a uranium enrichment should only be 3.67%. Once Trump backed out, Iran has reached 60% uranium enrichment, which is technically just a step back. The weapons grade quality is 90%. So that 30% is only a technical step away. So it's on the verge of going nuclear, weaponizing nuclear energy. It already is nuclear, but weaponizing that energy. So Israel knows that if this country goes nuclear, the first target is going to be Israel. So 6 Iranian nuclear scientists have been assassinated since 2007. The latest was Mohsin Fakhrizadeh. He was assassinated last year only in a Jason Bourne kind of an operation where artificial intelligence was used, and he was assassinated by an unmanned gun in an unmanned car. But that's a separate discussion altogether. The use of artificial intelligence
of solace, kind of
in war. So Israel is not going to take it lightly. It already has stepped into that Ukraine and Russia conflict because it does not want Iran to come back fully nuclearized. So that is one thing. They are not going to take it easy, and they will do any. And incidentally, there was this NATAM's nuclear facility in Iran. There was a cyber attack in 2021 itself, where there was a blackout in the whole nuclear complex, and most of its centrifuges, the thing required for the equipment required for enrichment of uranium went bust. That was an Israeli operation. So they will do anything to stop it. They will negotiate. If negotiation fails, the military option is always open for Israel. So that's a very interesting side play which is going on in the Middle East.
And this reminds me of India's relationship with Israel as well. I mean, India will have to look at Iran, but at the same time have to remember its own relationship with Israel. I mean, it's going to be quite an interesting
it's going to be a very
development, I think.
Tightrope for the Indian diplomacy.
Very difficult. And we are walking on that tightrope as we speak. But then, sir, we also referred to another reserve of oil, the largest reserve of oil in the world, Venezuela. Where does that bring Venezuela into the picture in this global energy crisis?
Venezuela is a story, is a fairy tale gone wrong.
Ah,
It was producing 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998. Hugo Chavez came into the picture in 1999, I believe. And all that populism, that socialist populism, has led to a situation where it's producing around 700,000 barrels per
that's
day.
massive. That's
That's a massive fall.
deterioration.
And it's an economic crisis. He was replaced by Nicolas Maduro, so who's a successor of Hugo Chavez in all senses.
Yes.
A lot of political crisis going on in Venezuela also.
There was a slight differentiation that went on, I think, because Trump supported someone else. There was another person who came into the picture.
He was
Guadino.
Juan Guaidino. So he was the Speaker of the National Assembly. So in 2018, there was an election where Juan said that this election was a fraudulent election. So he replaced Nicolas Maduro. He was replaced in 2019 by Juan. And US imposed sanctions on Venezuela. So Venezuela has inflation in triple digits as of now. That's massive again. Around 5.6 million people have left the country for Colombia. Colombia, remember, is not itself a fairy tale in itself.
It is not.
It is in tatters itself. So somebody migrating from one country to another, from Venezuela to a country like Colombia, says a lot about the happenings in Venezuela. So Venezuela, US has again started to approach Venezuela, which is again very interesting. It imposes sanctions, now it's reached out to Venezuela. And despite being the largest producer, having the largest oil reserves, it is only the 12th largest producer of oil. The machines are down, the whole equipment is down, and they say it's going to take around billions of dollars of investment and years together for Venezuela to come back as a main player in the system.
What is Caracas going to do about that?
Caracas, initially they supported Russia when it invaded Ukraine, and it was one of the very few countries which openly supported Putin. But now realizing the fact that US is interested, US wants to make peace, Caracas is obviously looking at some deals, because after that initial support, show of strength support to Putin, it has mellowed down. It has not supported his call for recognition of those provinces in Donbass. So it's staying silent. So the best part of geopolitics is that there comes a time when these smaller nations, which are generally ignored by the bigger powers, suddenly become important, and they know that they carry weight.
Yeah.
So Venezuela is having that time. Now let's see how it's going to pan out.
And also one has to remember its proximity to America, I mean United States of America.
Physically proximity to America, and ideologically proximity to Russia. So it's also walking a tightrope, because it's always been supported financially as well as militarily by Russia. So there are certain things which go, you buy equipment from Russia. Now immediately you cannot get equipments from America. You cannot replace them.
No.
You need spare parts, which is the case with India also.
Yes.
We need spare parts for those equipments from Russia. So walking away is not an easy option. No country can afford it. So it's again going to play out very dramatically. Let's see how it's going to finally end up.
And there's also a relationship that's brewing between Venezuela and China. We cannot ignore that in the picture as well. But then I think that calls for a different conversation.
That calls for a different conversation. So we can end this conversation maybe for the next one.
With the promise of that conversation.
That China is the biggest gainer of this conflict. Russia, Ukraine, the biggest gainer is China.
That's what it has envisioned for itself.
It's waiting on the sidelines.
Yes.
It is apprehensive because it's very close to Russia. So it has got apprehensions also. And it has its own interests to look after.
Yes.
So as of now, China is also playing a waiting game. It is basically waiting for things to pan out first, to stabilize, and see how the world reacts to this aggression, how it comes back, how the world economy is going to play out. But I think that's going to be let's have a dedicated talk on.
Certainly, sir. Certainly. Opens more avenues in the future, shall I say. So this is going to be a very interesting chapter in history books and in political science books, I'm
Definitely,
sure, within like 10 years.
Definitely.
So with the promise of that new chapter in geopolitics, this was our conversation on will oil change geopolitics again. This was Explain This. We were very grateful to have with us here today Dr. Mayank Singh sir. And until we meet again with new hopes of a more peaceful world, but more diplomatic opportunities in the future. Thank you so much. We would request you all to kindly like, share and subscribe and let us know what you liked about this video. Thank you so much.